who's streaming in. We're going to get started in a few minutes. In the meantime, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, we would love to know who you are and where you are.
I see. I know. From Indianapolis.
Nice.
Winnie Goldblatt.
Welcome, Dina. Hope all is well in New Orleans.
Santa Monica, Palm Beach, Burlington, Austin.
Hi, Toby. This is great. Hey, Kathy.
Or my tea.
Never sure what drink I want to bring with me to this, but tonight it's tea. Hi, Diane. Just going to wait a couple more minutes, let people join us. Esther, you got lots of people who have gotten the book and are starting to read it, which is great.
I see that. I love seeing that. Already ordered the book.
That's wonderful. I've got my copy right here.
Already received the book. Charleston, South Carolina. Great. Upper West Side of Manhattan.
This is the fun part, because when we hit 8 o'clock Eastern time, I think the participants number is going to very quickly start to accelerate.
Right, exactly. It starts to just.
Yeah.
Mindy from Pittsburgh is looking for her landsman. Renee, I also read this book in basically one day, but I was luckily trapped at a hockey tournament, so it was easy for me to have the time.
Right.
As people come in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We're going to get started in 1 minute.
It's fun to see where everybody's from.
I know, I love it. Hi, Joan. Do you want to kick us off today, Lex?
Sure. So welcome, everybody. This is quite a fun time. I say that because this is our third gathering together, and I can now vouch from experience. The second you've done something 3 times, I feel like it is an age-old tradition dating back to Sinai That's sort of how I see Jewish tradition if I've done something 3 times. So thank you to all of you who have now been along for the ride a few times. And thank you to all of you who are coming for the first time to this Quarantine Book Club, a partnership between the Jewish Women's Archive and Jewish Live. So tonight we have the wonderful Esther Safran Foer, who is our guest today and going to be talking about her new book that came out just a few days ago. So this is very, very cool. 2 days ago, right?
2 days ago.
Yeah, amazing. And so we're excited to dive in. And just, I've made this virtual background here for those who would like to purchase the book. We strongly encourage you to do so. We've made an easy link that you can head to when Esther just enthralls you and pulls you into the book and you're like, I've got to buy it now. So bit.ly/QBC, that's for Quarantine Book Club, and then Safran Foer. So that's really it for my side of the intro. We hope that you'll follow along what Jewish Live has been offering with all of our live streaming Jewish events at jewishlive.org and in our Facebook page, Jewish Live, that's all one word. But that's all I really got to say. I'm excited to listen in and learn tonight. So Judith, take us in.
Great. And do you need me to switch you off, Lex, or you could do that?
I'll turn my video off.
Okay, yeah. Great. Okay. So welcome everybody to the Quarantine Book Club. So glad to be with all of you tonight. As Lex said, I'm Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the CEO of JWA. And for those of you who don't know our work, we are a digital archive that's devoted to expanding the Jewish narrative. We document Jewish women's stories and elevate their voices, and we'll be talking about both of those pieces of our work tonight. And our goal is really to inspire all people to see themselves as history makers and to use history as a tool to better understand the issues that matter to us today. So when you go to our site, jwa.org, which is the world's biggest source of resources about Jewish women, you will find that we have many different kinds of programs, including our online book club, which offers book suggestions and original content for authors. And the Quarantine Book Club draws on these resources. So I hope that you will sign up for updates on our site and follow our book club also on Goodreads. I hope everyone is feeling well and healthy tonight. It's wonderful to see people streaming in. As we've said, as people have come in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We love to see where people are and where they're from. I hope that everybody is finding ways to keep breathing and connecting with others despite physical distancing. And tonight we're going to be exploring a story of resilience, which I think is something that we all are interested in cultivating, especially now. We expect to have a large crowd, which is fabulous, but also means that we can't have video and audio for all of the participants. But that's why we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and to add your questions and comments as we go along. I'll be drawing from those, and that will help us build community here. And for those of you who've been with us in the last couple of weeks, you know that it's kind of amazing to see what kind of community we're able to build, even when we can't all see each other's faces or hear each other's voices, but just to know that we're gathered together, each in our own homes, and thinking about stories and about survival and about family and the resources, the inner resources and familial resources that we draw on in ourselves and from our tradition. And it's something that can strengthen us all together. So I'm delighted to be here tonight with Esther Safran Foer. Esther was the executive director and CEO of Sixth and I for 10 years and really created it into a hub for very creative expressions of Jewish life. Prior to being recruited to Sixth and I by its founder, she spent most of her professional life working in public relations, eventually running her own firm. Esther is the daughter of Holocaust survivors, as you will hear more about tonight, and she's the mother of 3 sons, best-selling authors Frank, Jonathan, and Joshua Foer. And she herself is now also a wonderful writer and has published this really powerful memoir, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, which I hope you will read if you haven't already. And we're happy to celebrate the launch of Esther's book. So welcome, Esther.
Thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, especially with JWA. I've been a Jewish Women's Archives board member and am absolutely passionate about what JWA is doing to promote women's stories and to engage women in things like this Quarantine Book Club where we can form community. So thank you.
So Esther, why don't you start by telling us how you came to write this book?
Sure. It's been a kind of a lifelong pursuit, like lots of people, probably lots of you out there. Um, I was always asking, I had lots of questions about my family history. Coming from a family of Holocaust survivors, I often could not ask those questions. There was an understanding in the family that there were things you just couldn't talk about. You're raised by parents who had been through the horrors of the Holocaust. You didn't want to inflict any more pain on them by asking questions, and they weren't eager to tell you anything because they didn't want to inflict that pain on their children and maybe even on themselves for talking about it. But I was always looking. I was putting tidbits of information together. My children will tell you that in a way, they became my vehicle. When our oldest son, Frank, was in high school and had to do a senior project, I urged him to interview his grandmother. And I knew that she would talk to him in a way that she wouldn't talk to me. She would talk to him because she was preserving her legacy forever. It was a different relationship. And so he was probably the first one to do an in-depth interview many, many years ago. And then when our second son, Jonathan, was looking for a senior project in college, but wanted to also spend the summer in Prague, and wanted to tie the senior project to this adventure in Prague, I urged him to consider going to Ukraine, to the villages that I thought our family came from. I had this tiny picture of my father and the family that rescued him for some part of the war. We don't know for how long. It could have been weeks, months, it could have been years. And to see if he could find that family. And that turned out to be a great idea for him for a senior project at Princeton. But he went there, and it turns out I didn't have enough information to give him. He ultimately did not go to the right town. He also was a poor college student. He didn't have the resources to hire a good translator. And if you've read the book, you might know that the translator was, I don't think as funny as he wrote it, but not very experienced. So he took that amazing trip and didn't find anything. But what he wrote turned out to be a bestseller and was turned into a movie. And I started to get calls almost literally from all over the world, from survivors from these shtetls that our family came from, and called me and said, nothing he wrote is true. Well, of course it wasn't true. It was a novel. It was a work of art. And they started to tell me little pieces of the stories. And I would just piece them together. He went in 1998. And I was running Sixth and I, this cultural institution. I would just piece things together as I traveled in Israel or Brazil, visiting family. I would meet survivors. I would meet people who had some information. And every little piece started to add up to the fact that I now needed to go. And then in 2009, there was a trip of Trochenbrod survivors, second and third generation, and a few survivors going back to the village to repair the memorials that were there, to keep the memory alive. And that was just the perfect vehicle that I could use to hang my trip on. There were also some people who had done a lot of work in Ukraine from Trochenbrod and had hired researchers and translators there. So I had people that I could reach out to. So in 2009, having done a lot of research, having interviewed a lot of people, having learned that you can't just call people by their name, I was looking for people who knew my father, Louis Safran. People weren't using last names. And were using nicknames, and they had these wonderful, funny nicknames. There's, Itzhak the belly button, and somebody who was an albino. Well, it turned out my father had a nickname. It was a label from Liszt. Liszt was a little village he was living in with his wife and daughter. So in 2009, armed with information, having already hired somebody to go and do some groundwork for me, who thought they had found the family that hid my father and sent me pictures, I thought could be, but I wasn't convinced. So as part of my search, I even hired a former FBI forensic photography expert, actually head of the FBI forensic photography lab, to look at the pictures. And we spent an hour together. We looked through a little crosshairs and measured distances. And at the end of the hour, he said, I can't tell you it's them. And seeing how disappointed I was, he looked at me and he said, but I can't tell you it's not them. Mm. And then he gave me an incredible clue. He said, if you're really going to Ukraine, look at the clothes that people are wearing in photographs. These are people with very limited wardrobes. They live in shtetls on dirt roads. And that ultimately turned out to be a very important clue for me when I went and actually found the family that hid my father.
So you've already said so many things that I want to follow up on. So, well, two things that I think I want to pull out to start. One is just about, and I want to just mention this and then I think we'll get back to it, but thinking about the kind of the generations and how stories are shared or not shared from generation to generation, and how different it is to tell a story to a grandchild than to tell it to a daughter, for example, right? And that's something that you had to navigate throughout your life with your mom, asking questions along the way and trying to kind of pull out information that you could. But also you talked about the fact that there were a lot of holes in the stories that you had inherited and little clues that you had to trace. And I actually have some of the pictures that you shared with me, which I'm gonna put up on the screen to give a sense of where you were starting with some of these photos and what were the things that you were then pulling out as you were starting to write. So let's take a look at, here we go. Can people see this photo of Esther holding the picture that she was just mentioning that she had to look over with the FBI forensic guy?
So this picture had been in our family for years and years. And it was interesting. On the back of it, there was some writing and some numbers. The numbers absolutely made sense. They didn't have a lot of paper. My mother would calculate on any piece of paper. She was good with numbers, and she could go to a grocery store and keep everybody waiting in line while she added everything up in her head. So there were lots of scribblings on this. I went to people and said, well, what does this say? And nobody could, I thought maybe it was an address. Nobody could identify that, but there was something that looked like Augustine on it. And hence, when Jonathan wrote his novel, he was in search of Augustine. Actually, that was irrelevant, and Augustine had nothing to do with the story. But that's how his story evolved, which is kind of fun.
Comes out of a red herring, right? So, and you had some photos of your parents, which, as you did, as you mentioned, a tremendous amount of research, both contacting people all over the globe to hear their stories and talking to FBI forensic folks, but also looking at pictures and learning to look at them in different ways and learn new things about your family. I'm going to pull up a couple of the things that also documents that you had about yourself that gave you some hints about some of the secrets and lies that had been kind of swirling around in your past. Let's skip that one.
So when you get the book, you're going to see the first line, and it's really kind of interesting. I have a birth certificate. This is a picture of it. It says that I was born September 8th, 1946 in Ziegenheim, Germany. I wasn't born in September. I wasn't born on the 8th day of any year. I wasn't born in Ziegenheim, and I wasn't even born in Germany. And I knew that this was fabricated for a reason, but it wasn't until writing the book and doing research that I came to understand what the reason was. It turned out we entered the United States in August of 1949. And we entered on under something called the 1948 DP Immigration Act. And when I read the act and read about it, I understood why these falsifications had been created. And this wasn't the only thing. I have documents where you can see numbers have been changed a little. The 1948 DP Immigration Act, you've got to remember that 6 million Jews were killed and 200,000 to 300,000 survivors were wandering through Europe and they had nowhere to go. Nobody wanted Jewish survivors, and going home was not an option. Their families had been killed, their property had been taken, and nobody wanted them back. The 1948 DP Immigration Act, which was passed by Congress at the urging of President Truman, was something that ultimately Truman didn't want to sign because when you read the act, it was blatantly anti-Semitic. It said that in order to enter the United States under the provisions of this act, they wanted 30% of the people to be farmers. There weren't a lot of Jewish farmers, although I have a document created in my father's name that says he was a first-class farmer. And you had to have been in Germany by December of 1945. Well, the Jews who had survived, there were very few survivors in concentration camps. The ones who had survived were on the run, like my parents. They were in Russia. My mother made it all the way to Asia, to Kazakhstan. They didn't have enough time to get back to Germany by December of 1945. And the people who wrote that act knew that. So we had to, and if my parents had said that I was born as I was in March of 1946, actually on Purim, it would have been clear that they had not been in Germany by December of 1945. So how do you deal with that? You create a new birth certificate. Jews were very clever, and they did what they had to do to find a way out of the hell of Europe. And when you look at the numbers, 200,000 people were supposed to have been admitted to the United States under that act. Only about 80,000 were Jews, because they were taking displaced persons from other countries because it was a war, and there were displaced persons from Poland and Ukraine and Belarus. And it's been reported that about 10,000 of the people that were admitted into the country were Nazis. So I find this really interesting, particularly in this time when we're looking at all the refugees around the world. Fact of the matter is, I'm a dreamer. I came here on false papers. And yes, but I became a United States citizen. You can see this is my citizenship document. I ended up, as I was writing this book, and I start the book talking about the falsification of these documents, my husband, who was a lawyer, said, "You can't do that." Other lawyers said that to me. And I thought, in this day and age, what's going on with refugees around the world? I have to tell this story. And I consulted, ultimately on the advice of a friend who was in the Obama administration heading immigration policy. I consulted the lawyer who was head of the U.S. Lawyers Immigration, head U.S. Lawyer Immigration Association, something like that. And we had a wonderful conversation. And he said, "You know, you're probably not at risk, but on the other hand, I can't tell you that you're not. I can't tell you that you're not vulnerable." And I said, "Well, what would I do?" And he said, "Well, if they decide to deport you," and by the way, the Trump administration has an office that's been set up, an office called an Office of Denaturalization, people who have become naturalized citizens who are then potentially subject to denaturalization. So he said, "Well, your husband or your children could petition for you." Can you imagine? Right. And then his parting words to me were, "Go get a Polish citizen, go get a Polish passport." I'm actually working on it.
Wow. Well, it gives you a sense of how live these issues are and how relevant they are to the moment, and that they, although we think of our family history as alive to us, but not necessarily part of our,
The other thing that was really interesting, and we don't have a picture of it here, but in researching the book, I found a bunch of old letters that my mother and I translated together. And there was a letter from my great uncle in Brazil who wanted us to come to Brazil. That was actually our first choice because my mother had a large family there. And when we ended up in the United States, his final letter in December of 49 was, "I'm so glad, this is to my mother, that you've been able to end your wandering.
Mm.
But remember, even in the beautiful America, there's anti-Semitism."
Mm.
And that's also kind of poignant right now.
Right, absolutely. So I want to show a few of the pictures that you looked at closely of your parents to have some more context about their lives after the war.
So it was really interesting. I came here as a toddler. And if people said, well, what was life like? I mean, we were in displaced persons camps. I would say, well, it was happy. The displaced persons camps had the highest birth rate of any place in the world. These refugees who had lost everything and everyone in their family were trying to rebuild their lives and rebuild their families. So my memories, such as they are kind of happy, loved by two parents, loved by the larger community. I have pictures of me in, a little fur coat that somehow my parents were able to get me, and on a tricycle, which I remember was the envy of the other kids in the camp. And in writing this book, so I'm trying to pick out pictures. And when you first look at pictures, you see the picture on the left, my father holding me. Well, that's kind of a happy picture. But then you take a closer look, and behind us are army barracks. Our first DP camp in Ziegenheim, Germany, was a former POW camp. They had just kicked the POWs out and brought the Jews in. The camps were filthy. There weren't any proper facilities. Apparently, when I asked my mother, I said, well, what was my crib like? She said, crib? Although you can see I have a carriage here. She said, we all slept on army cots. And there were some partitions in between various family groups. The second picture with my parents, here, two people pushing their precious child. But if you look closely, which I didn't do until I was writing the book, you see watchtowers. And my mother's told me there was barbed wire around the camp. We were still prisoners. The other interesting thing is, look at how everybody is dressed. And all the pictures I have, my father's always in a suit and a tie. If you look at the man next to him in the picture on the left, Aaron Brenner, who was kind of an uncle to me, looks very natty. These people were looking into the future. They didn't want to be refugees. This was their aspirational clothing. And they were all dressed as beautifully as was possible for them at this point.
Right, and you see that in this next picture too. They're all dressed to the nines, really, and this is just a few years after the war.
This picture was taken in 1947 in the Fernwald concentration DP camp that's near Munich. And these are survivors from the town of Trochenbrod. And look at them. Everybody's got a suit on. Almost. The women look beautiful. Everybody
Right. Their hair is done in a lovely way, right?
Done right. This was a town that had, when it was tiny, 1,500 people. This is what was left of it.
Wow.
At some point, it had 3,000 because refugees from Poland were starting to go west and had poured into these shtetls, hoping that would be their way of survival.
So you mentioned that, they were really forward looking, not wanting to talk much about the past, not really wanting you to ask necessarily questions about the past, and you sort of internalized that and wanted to be the good girl who brought them joy. So what was it like growing up in a family with those secrets? And you actually mentioned something earlier, which is a hint to those secrets, which is you mentioned your father living somewhere with his wife and daughter. So
Right.
tell us a little bit about uncovering that secret.
So I was about 40. I was always asking very delicate questions of my mother. I couldn't be straightforward. I'd have to sort of sneak something in. And she was pretty clever. She'd give me just as much as she wanted to give me. But once in a while, something slipped out. And in this particular conversation, we were talking about the shtetls. And she said something about, well, your father's wife and daughter who were killed. And it's like, really? You know, I'm now the mother of 3 children, and you're telling me now that I had a half sister who was killed in the Holocaust? And I asked her lots more questions, and she said, you know, we didn't talk about anything. And she knew how to close down a question. She'd say, Ganig, you know, enough. And that was the end of the conversation. But I couldn't let go of that fact. And I searched databases, the Yad Vashem databases, the Holocaust Museum databases. New documents are constantly being made available through the Red Cross Tracing Service. And there was no record that I could find. And I now know there was no record. There were so many people who were killed and so many babies whose names will never be recorded, that we'll never know that these children even lived. And that really tore at me. I had a half sibling whose name I didn't know, whose name didn't exist. I couldn't bring her back to life, but I could at least try to find her name. And I'd ask relatives all over the world, you know, my father's partners in Brazil and his cousins in Israel, and they'd all say there were so many people killed and so many babies. How can we remember all their names? This wasn't just another person to me. This was my half sister.
Yeah. And it seems that, you know, in the book, you talk about how much that drove the whole process of trying to piece everything together. Go ahead.
It was something I thought I would never find, but I realized I needed to go make this trip myself, that I had encouraged, you might call it child labor, had my sons interview their grandmother, had Jonathan go to Ukraine. And I realized I had to do this myself. I had to own this story. And I had to go. And it took a lot of courage to pick myself up and do it. The hardest part of which was telling my mother. My mother was a tiny little strong woman. And I kept putting it off and putting it off. And meanwhile, there was this whole group of Trucking brothers going. And my oldest son, Frank, said he would go with me. And I had to tell her. I just couldn't disappear on her.
What were you afraid of?
You know, I was the good child, you know, I was the good little girl. I was supposed to make her happy. Now I was going to, you know, make her sad by going to this place where the worst things that could happen to anybody happened to her. And I was right to be afraid.
The wrath of your mother poured forth.
Yes, I finally went to see her and I said, look, you know, this trip is coming up. And we didn't tell her when Jonathan went because she would have been horrified. I said, I'm going to take this trip. And she's, how can you do this to me? I mean, she thought I was going to leave her now.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else had left her.
Right.
And then I said, well, you know, it's okay. Frank is coming with me. And my son, you know, is a journalist and full-grown person, and I thought she'd feel great about that. She said, you're taking your child? And it was bad enough that I was going to put myself in danger, but she said, your child, he has babies. How can you do this? And I could see all her fears lived out. And then the next day she called me, and she probably didn't sleep that night. And she was very European, had an accent, but she was very modern. And she said, I want you to understand where my fears are coming from. And she told me she was afraid that something would happen to us. Then the next call that I had to make to her was right before I left, and I had to say goodbye. And her parting words were, which she said to me more than once, don't do anything stupid. And bring some food with you. Don't eat anything they make for you. And bring a good book and stay in your room.
Well, can understand that
Yeah.
advice, and based on her own experience. So you talked about, in the book, you use the language to describe yourself as being this kind of hinge generation, that you were this hinge between, your mother's story and then passing it on to your sons, and that they were the storytellers. And you just said that this was your time to kind of own the story and to become the storyteller here, and become a writer yourself, right? So what has it meant to you to take ownership of the story, and how has writing this book maybe shifted the way that you see yourself and your role in the family?
Oh, dramatically. First of all, because this is probably mostly women, I can tell you that you can change careers and you can do new things and undertake things you haven't tried. And for me, I'm not a writer, despite the fact that we have 3 sons who are writers. And I don't think of them as writers, they're storytellers. I didn't know that I could do it. Originally, I had talked to our oldest son, Frank, who went with me and had written several successful books. And I said, let's write this book together. And it turned out that he had things he had to do. He had a book that he had to finish. And I ended up with a wonderful agent who gave me very good advice. He said, this has to be your story. You have to own it, and it has to be in your voice. And in writing it, I found my voice, not just on paper and not just on the pages of this book, but I found that I do have a voice, that I can own the story. And the process of writing it has brought me peace.
Mm.
Is it the whole truth? I don't know. I will never know the whole truth. But I did the journey. I was able to complete the mission of writing this story. I originally thought I would write it so that my children, my grandchildren, their grandchildren would know the family history, would know that their family had been through the most awful period in history, but had survived. That how resilient my mother was and how strong she was. And that there were going to be tough times for them, but that they could survive it.
Right.
And probably the best day of this book experience, of course, I was going to go on a book tour all over the US and Europe. And of course, we all know what happened.
We're all coming to you, it turns out.
So we're doing these wonderful launches. I'm so grateful to JWA for doing this. But my oldest grandson put a video together, and he interviewed his cousins and his brother and his uncles, celebrating Grandma's publication day. And it made it all worthwhile.
Well, and I think it's one of the things that's really inspiring about your book is that it's clear that it was a process of coming to believe you could do this, that it wasn't obvious to you from the beginning that this is how you were going to, of course you were going to write this book, right? I mean, from the outside, knowing who your sons are, right? Knowing what accomplished writers they are, and then reading your book and seeing how beautiful and sensitive it is, it doesn't seem as a reader like anything but obvious that you would write this book. But I know that for you, it being this long, long journey, and I think that it does come through, that this kind of challenge to other people to think about the ways in which you can step into the thing that you might not think you can do, and try to put yourself out there. And it is very inspiring. And I think it also speaks, and of course I would think this because this is the world that I live in, but I think it also speaks about the role of women in transmitting memory. That this was part of your journey, was to figure out how you would tell the story, not only to pass it on to the next generation, but also to make it your own.
Absolutely, absolutely, to make it my own. And in the process of writing this, I, read lots of histories and other memoirs. And I think it was Rabbi Sachs, I'm not sure who writes about the fact that Jews are not a people of history. We are a people of memory. And that when you go through the Bible and services and Yom Kippur, and it's remember, remember, remember. And history's the end of something. It's a story about something that happened and you let go of it. But memory, books like this, other memoirs that I've written, other memoirs that I've read, now this is the only book I've written, are real stories about real people, are things you can feel. And it made it so clear to me why we are a people of memory, why we on Yom Kippur say Isker every year, and how important that is to bring those memories forward. And when in the writing of this book, to bring those memories alive. It's a curious fact that there's no word in Hebrew for history. They do use historia, which comes from Greek and then English, but it's always remember.
Mm-hmm. Right. And interestingly, you talk about how your book, finishing your book, coincided with your mother passing away.
So it was, I had a February, I think, 1 deadline of 2019 to turn in the book. And my mother was dying. She lived with us the last 3.5 years of her life. And I have to tell you, as difficult as that sometimes was, it was just an incredibly beautiful experience. She was strong to the end. She never complained. She thanked us for every little thing. She died on December 18th, 2018, which my daughter-in-law immediately said, leave it to Bubby to die on the 18th day of 2018. A woman who was such a survivor would have loved that even in death, she was associated with life. But I had a good, what I thought was a good draft done because I knew she was dying. But somehow between the time she died, and I guess, I didn't do any writing while we were sitting Shiva. So in the last month and a half, I was able to open myself up in a way that I couldn't when she was alive. Even laying there sick in our house, there were things I couldn't put on paper that I couldn't say because I wasn't sure she'd want me to say them because they were her struggles. And somehow in that last month and a half, I didn't do a major rewrite, but I was able to tell stories and put emotions into the book that I couldn't while she was alive.
In some ways that
watching over me.
Right. In some ways, I feel like that I hadn't thought about it this way before, but in some ways, I feel like that's sort of the last gift that she gave you, was allowing you to take the story and fully own it and put it out there.
Oh, that's beautiful. I hadn't thought about that either. And I will tell you, at her funeral, which was nothing short of amazing, there were hundreds of people there. Her friends, our friends. When she moved in with us, she became an active member of our community and a whole senior program. And they would come and visit her when she could no longer go to the synagogue. And her great grandchildren's friends came to the funeral because she was everybody's Bubby. And the night before the burial, I remembered that I had brought dirt back from all of the mass graves that I visited. And I found the dirt from where her mother and her sisters and her nieces are buried. And I was able to put that into her grave.
And that also is like, it feels like a symbol of the kind of weaving together that you were able to do by telling the story, taking the different pieces from different places and making it one story that could be carried on. And in some ways you brought that closure for your mom and her family too. I want to be able to take some, I could go on talking to you forever. As you know, we love to talk to each other, but I want to be able to include other people's questions in the conversation too. So we have a question that I saw here, but now have lost, from Janet, who asks how you respond to those who say that we as a people need to move forward and stop focusing on the kind of rough parts of Jewish history or Jewish people as martyrs, whether through Holocaust or other periods.
That's a great question. We have 3 sons. We have 6 grandchildren. I don't want them to be Jewish because of the Holocaust. I want them to be Jewish because of the beauty of Judaism. But this is where they came from. And I think we all need to understand where we came from. It's not, ours is not a dark house. We're a really upbeat, optimistic family. This is their story, though. This is who they are. All of them have names that they carry from people who died in the Holocaust. I want them to be proud of that, to make their own names. But how do you go forward without knowing where you came from?
Right. And we know, and you already referred to this, we know that the way that children build resilience is hearing about other times that people have in their family have overcome hardship. And your book also is full of life and full of joy and laughter and jokes. And you make it very clear that the inheritance that you're passing on is not one just of suffering and degradation.
Definitely not. And there are jokes in there. And I thought, well, from our trip, there were some real characters on the trip. When the Israelis arrived and Frank and I are at the hotel, and all of a sudden you hear all this Hebrew and you think, oh my God, the IDF has come to save us. And the people there were absolutely, there was a lot of bad jokes and improper behavior, as they were making fun of Ukrainians. Sorry to say that. And I thought about taking those jokes out, and I thought, no, it doesn't make it any less poignant to have humor.
It makes it real. It makes it
real.
Makes it clear that these are real people you're talking about. In some ways, that's really important also, because there's a tendency sometimes when you tell these stories of such dramatic stories, like the stories of the Holocaust, to flatten people as if they are just kind of icons of some kind, as opposed to real living people. And that's also part of what you uncovered in your research, was that these are people who had the usual foibles. There were crooks, and there were people having affairs, and there were people who were, that your mother, in fact, was in a fight with her mom when she left home. Right? Like, what could be more normal than a young woman fighting with her mother and storming off?
And you and I have talked about this. I heard about abortions, and I thought, wow, did that happen? But of course, life happened there.
Right. Yes. People should feel free to add questions to the chat box. I want to show a couple more pictures that you shared, because you were talking about some of the characters that you met in Ukraine. And we have a photo here of you and Frank with one of the several Annas, right?
Right. So for some reason, most of the main characters were named Anna, and several of the men were named Ivan. Go figure. So this is in this tiny village, dirt road with just a handful of houses lining the street, where my father and his first wife and his daughter lived. And we were talking to the descendants of the family, who I keep in touch with, by the way. They call us their American family, and we call them our Ukrainian family. They saved us, we're alive, because of what their ancestors did. So we're sitting in this house and we're sharing pictures, and I'm trying to do what the FBI agent suggested, and measuring the distance between ears and analyzing the pictures, but actually seeing some of the same clothes, which was a great clue from him. The single guy who lives in this house, who was the grandson of the man who hid my father, kept saying, I'm going to go find the old lady down the street. And everybody's going, nah, forget her. We're doing important things. And he picked himself up at some point and went and got the old lady, whose name was Anna. Here she is. And Anna walks into the room, and she picks up the picture, the one that you saw me holding in the beginning. And she goes, oh, that's labeled my father's name. And that's David. He hid in this house. I remember when he came out from hiding. And Frank and I are like, really? This is for real? And I actually leaned over to Frank at that point and said, Frank, do you think this is true? This is real? And he said 110%.
Mm.
And then I said, well, he had a wife. And she said, oh, Zipporah. I remember she was a great seamstress. I remember some of the things she made. And the pieces were all coming together. And I was kind of breathless at this point, but Frank picked up the courage and he said, they had a baby. And she said, she wasn't a baby. She was about 5 or 6 years old. And she had long black hair. And she always played with this ball in the field. And then she looked at me because she understood the relationship and said, your sister's name was Asya.
Mm.
This is like 70 years after the Holocaust. This woman has since died because I keep track of these people in Ukraine. We went at just the right time. I found something I thought I would never find. I couldn't bring Asya back to life, but I rescued her name. And as you'll see in the book, our youngest granddaughter, and this is kind of poignant, you couldn't make some of this stuff up. She was born April 29th. Actually, she's going to be 3 years old in a few weeks. And she was born on the Shabbat, right between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, between the commemoration of the Holocaust and the celebration of the birth of the state of Israel. And the night she was born, my son called and he asked my permission to give her the middle name of Asya. She is B. Asya Foer, and she's a little pistol. And she will know where she came from. She is joyful. I'm sure her life will be amazing, but she'll carry on that memory and she'll know where she came from.
Right. And that's where the story goes forward. And you made sure that your family would be, and its survival would be represented not only in the book, but throughout your whole trip. And you write in the book about how important it was for you to bring something to leave behind.
So every year we do this Rosh Hashanah card. And it's really important to me to have the whole family together, to not create a collage, but to understand that we're all there together. This was the last card that had my mother in it, and she's obviously sitting between some of her great-grandchildren. And when I went, I thought, I want to leave something of myself behind. But what am I going to leave? And I decided to take a stack of my Rosh Hashanah cards. And at every mass grave we went to where we knew our family had been buried, and sadly, it was a lot of mass graves. We had borrowed a fork from the hotel, which we returned. And Frank, usually it was Frank doing the hard work, would dig a hole right next to the mass grave and put our picture in it. And it was my way to tell my grandmothers and my aunts and the rest of the family that's in those mass graves that they didn't know anybody would survive, but that we are still here, that they have descendants who are still here. And then the other interesting thing is this picture. So I would bury these in the dirt near the mass graves. And 2 years later, I met a lot of Ukrainians who helped me on this journey, who helped me gather information, who took us around. 2 years later, I got a picture. I actually got 2 different emails. First, from Sergey, who was our tour guide in Trochenbrod. And he said, I was showing somebody the cemetery. I was showing somebody Trochenbrod, and your picture was coming out of the ground. Now, this is 2 years later in the Ukrainian winters with snow and rain, and the picture was still there. And then about a month later, Anna, who was our tour guide and translator, sent me this picture. Obviously, Sergey or somebody put it in plastic to preserve it. And it was still there then. And the stones you see were brought by some of the descendants of Trochenbrod who came on the trip with us. where they had brought these stones from Israel and put Jewish stars in them and put them on the mass graves.
It's amazing. It is another one of these symbols that feels like if I read it in a novel, I would think it was a little bit.
Who would make that up?
Right. Who would make that up? But it's amazing to see.
It was totally amazing. And, the Ukrainians that we met were intelligent, wonderful people, but they're not taught about the Holocaust. They don't know what happened. In the beginning of the trip, when we'd ask them questions about it, they'd call it the problem. And I think by going there, Frank and I both came to understand them a little better and empathize with what they also went through. Not what we went through, not what the Jews went through, but this part of the world has suffered for generations. Tim Snyder wrote this book called The Bloodlands. This part of the world is the Bloodlands that people fought over and murdered each other over.
And I think also what you're referring to, the sort of failure of language to describe the horrors of the Holocaust is why it's so important that people like you write these kinds of books that try to give some language to it, because it is so hard to wrap one's brain around. And it's hard, it's almost unspeakable. And so then it's a big challenge for a writer. How do you write what is, what eludes articulation? But by putting it into some words and your own story, it makes it real in a different way.
Well, it was as I was trying to write this book, I thought, well, I'm not a writer. I don't really enjoy writing. So I just wrote it as I would tell it to somebody in the plainest language to convey the story. But it does make it real because it's about real people. And there's a section in the book where I list name after name, describe my Aunt Lifsha and what happened to her, and my Aunt Pesha and what happened to her. And it's almost a page of names. And I remember somebody looking at it and saying, I don't know that this is going to resonate for people. And I really didn't care. I was putting their names down. I wanted their names to be permanently somewhere. And it is. I mean, this is all that I can do to remember them.
Right. And that's the piece that is so important about elevating voices, that these voices are out there, but we can't hear them if someone doesn't help lift them up. And you did so beautifully. So how does it feel to have the book out there now?
Phew. It was really hard. I not too long ago, I gave it to a friend of mine who lives up the street. And at this point, by the way, my sons did not read it until it was essentially done. I don't know whether I was afraid to give it to them, but I just, once I decided it had to be my voice, I just went with that. And then maybe a couple of weeks ago, I had gotten my pre-publication copies, and I gave one to a friend of ours up the street who I think of as a really intelligent guy. And I was so anxious because it's one thing, I wrote it. Ultimately, I had the courage to share it with my children. But now I was sharing it with somebody who I really respected, who I knew personally. In a way, the hardest thing is giving it to people you know, because you're exposing yourself. You're sharing a part of yourself that they don't know anything about. And you don't know how you'll be received. But in the end, it doesn't matter. The only thing that I know why I wrote the book, and I know that my grandchildren will value it, and that long after the books we have on our shelves are going to be thrown away, that generations of our family will have this book and look at it and understand where they came from.
It's an incredible achievement, and it's a beautiful book. We have a question from someone asking if you think that your mother would have told her story differently, or how she might have
Yes.
told her life story?
Well, first of all, my mother, for a good bit of her life, never thought of herself as a Holocaust survivor. In her mind, Holocaust survivors were only people who were in concentration camps. And I often, when I would interview her, or when I would ask her questions, or she'd give us, she ultimately would speak to school groups and enjoyed that. She would read books and tell other people's stories.
Hmm.
And I have some of her notes still. And, I remember sitting there and going, Ma, they want to hear your story. And I don't know whether she felt she hadn't suffered enough because she wasn't in a concentration camp, because of her pride that she wanted it to sound perfect, and was using what other people had said and thought that sounded better. No, she wouldn't write this story. And it's why I couldn't ultimately finish it while she was alive.
Did she ever tell you how she felt about you writing it?
So she knew I was writing a book, but in a family like ours, people write books.
Right.
So, and the last years of her life, while her mind was always good, she couldn't, I don't think she really absorbed what I was writing about.
Mm-hmm. So one of our attendees wants to know what's next for you. Do you have other writing projects that you're planning on? Or?
Next for me. And Judith, you know me, and I know some of our attendees do. I'm always looking for what's next. At my last talk 2 days ago, someone suggested turning this into a children's book, which would be quite a different way to tell the story. I love art. I do collage art. I'm not sure what the next project is, but there will be one. Stay tuned.
I am sure it will be. We're waiting with bated breath. I'm sure it will be exciting, and I think it's part of the of course you don't know, and if you knew, it probably you'd be wrong, because whatever is going to come next is going to come out of the kind of flowering of this project, and you've just put it out there, and there's going to be so many interesting conversations and stories, I'm sure, that will come back to you. So
and I've heard from 2 days ago when I spoke, I've gotten a ton of emails, and some from people who have stories that are similar than mine and want to connect and want to know what they should do with their stories.
Right.
That was very fulfilling.
Yeah, and that's actually something that people have asked us before about how we could support women who want to write their family history, because there are a lot of people who want to do that, who, like you, have often been the ones who heard a lot of stories or who did research and then passed it on, but didn't necessarily think of telling it themselves. And so there's really an opportunity for women to think about how they tell those stories and what their role is as their family, tale bearers and researchers and all of that.
Let's have JWA create some sort of a program and do it.
Exactly. Well, and part of what we do is part of why we share the stories that we share is to inspire people to understand that their stories are part of history. We all are part of history, and we've created oral history tools and question sets and a new mobile app so that people who are inspired by things like your book can do those interviews and ask those questions and record for themselves and then share it back with us so that it is preserved in some way and not just on tapes in your attic that eventually become obsolete. I know I have plenty of those.
And it doesn't have to be a monumental story. I mean, in the same way that my mother never thought of herself as a Holocaust survivor. These are stories that need to be preserved.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Esther, for writing this book, first of all, and then for coming to share it with us tonight. It was really it's a beautiful book. And I know just from looking at the comments that are coming through here that this has been meaningful for a lot of people, and exactly the kinds of stories that we need to be thinking about and focusing on now. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to celebrate survival and storytelling and family together. We have a survey that we would love for people to take if they haven't taken it one of the previous nights. So I think Mickey might share it in the chat box. She just did. This was the third in a series of virtual book club meetings, and I'm very happy to share that due to popular demand, we are extending the series. We've added 5 more sessions so far, which you will find advertised at jwa.org and on Facebook and elsewhere, Jewish Live. Our next meeting is going to be on Sunday, April 12th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring poet and singer-songwriter Alicia Jo Rabins. She's going to be exploring poetry and midrash and Passover stories. It's during the intermediate days of Passover. So I hope you will join us for that. And we have several more talks coming after that with Sarah Hurwitz and Abby Stein and Laura Geller and Anna Solomon. And we may be adding more. We hope that this quarantine isn't going to go on much longer, but we are here for as long as it does, and probably afterwards too, because we're finding this to be a really great way to connect and build community. So I encourage you to follow JWA on whatever channels you use, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Goodreads. We've also, I want to let you know, just launched a new season of our podcast, Can We Talk, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on our site. So we hope that we will be seeing you again here and elsewhere. And there's so many ways to engage in Jewish women's stories and to connect with JWA. And again, thank you, Esther, for being with us tonight. Lex, did you want to say? Oh,
yeah, I would love to. First off, thank you, Esther. This was incredibly moving and just a beautiful, beautiful, hour, but it's going to be many more because I'm going to go and read this book. I encourage everybody else to, I know it's cheesy, but there is this link right here, bit.ly/QBC for Quarantine Book Club, Safran Foer, and I'll put it in the chat box in just a second. I also want to give, I also want to encourage people to read an article that Judith is probably, I assume, not going to shout out herself, but it's a beautiful piece she co-wrote that was released today in E-Jewish Philanthropy called COVID-19 Shows We Have Choices. And I really encourage everybody to read that piece. I'm putting it in the chat box right as we speak. Judith and a number of other women wrote a really important article for all of us to read at this moment. So I encourage you to check that out.
Thank you, Lex. I have to give a major shout out to Rebecca Neuwirth, who is the primary writer on that. I can't take major credit for that one.
No worries. It's an important read. And just, I want to emphasize, we've got some great book clubs coming up. The next 3 actually. So Alicia Jo Rabins is coming up. She's wonderful. The next 3 guests, Alicia Jo Rabins, Sarah Hurwitz, and Abby Stein, we're all guests in the relative recent past on the Judaism Unbound podcast. And to sort of prep, if you would like, for those book clubs, we'll release those podcasts on the Judaism Unbound page. But it's been such a pleasure to share these first few meetings with you. We hope that you'll join us in the future. Thank you all so much.
And I want to wish everybody a happy and healthy Passover. Please stay safe, stay calm, keep breathing, and early Chag Sameach to everybody. Thank you so much. Good night.